Hello, everybody. I am here with Dr. Chad McIntosh. Chad has a PhD in philosophy from Cornell, which also happens to be my alma mater, and I'm representing today, even if Chad isn't. And and Chad, for his PhD, kind of studied group personhood and things along those lines, especially as it relates to the Trinity. Chad is also, you're going to be the editor of an up and coming Four Views book on the Trinity. And I think you also contribute to Dale Tuggy's Trinities blog from time to time. Is that right?
Years ago I did, but I've kind of dropped that ball.
Sure, sure. So yeah, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Chad, and how you got interested in these topics?
Sure. Well, I have a BA in philosophy from Calvin College, an MA and PhD in philosophy from Cornell University, but I brought to university studies an interest in philosophy. I was one of those rare kids in high school who actually like straight up knew what he wanted to do. I knew basically as a sophomore, junior that I wanted to pursue philosophy, and so that was a very single-minded course for me. And the reason I wound up wanting to study philosophy is connected to how I became a Christian in high school. I grew up being very troubled by the problem of evil. I thought that there's no way a loving God would permit the sort of evil and suffering that we see in the world. And so that made me despair in a lot of ways. I yearned for a meaning in life and wanted to have this fulfilled life. And I was really enamored with the idea of like a perfect love, a perfect relationship. But when it became clear to me that, well, if God doesn't exist, that's not possible, and life probably isn't meaningful, I I grew pretty close to suicide, really. And
Wow.
I remember walking around in my neighborhood one night feeling pretty miserable, and I just looked up at the stars and said, like, I can't go on living this way. This is so miserable. I need change in my life. I need change in my life. And well, lo and behold, not but a week later, I got kicked out of my high school for fighting. I got into a pretty nasty fight. It became clear that I couldn't go back to that school, and I started attending a local Christian school instead. And that was a major culture shock for me because I didn't grow up going to church. I wasn't around a lot of Christians. And so seeing things like students pray before tests was really weird to me. I mean, if you're outside of the world of evangelicalism, there is a language that you need to learn, and you just
Mm-hmm.
don't know it.
Yeah.
You're a fish out of water. And that was me in high school, and I think the other students recognized that because they started evangelizing to me pretty quickly. And I wanted to return the favor. I wanted to try to convince them that God did not exist. And so that's when I started studying philosophy. I was like, oh, what resources can I get into that would be ammunition against these students? And I was like, philosophy. So I started studying basic philosophy. I picked up this book from a local bookstore called The Atheist Debater's Handbook. I was memorizing these arguments, and these high school students don't really,
Right.
most of them are not really well versed in like apologetics and things, so it didn't go well for a lot of them. And so that was my introduction to philosophy. But long story short, I wound up getting invited to a youth group where the youth pastor had a degree in philosophy. And I was like, oh, great. So I showed up and I talked with him, and I thought my conversation with him would go about as well as it was going for me and the students at this Christian school. Well, that was a big shock, too, because he had done his homework. He knew Alvin Plantinga. He knew the work of like Craig and these philosophers. And he just very gently and graciously disarmed all of these weak arguments that I had been memorizing from the Atheist Debater's Handbook. And he sent me home with two much more compelling books. One was Craig's Reasonable Faith, and the other one was Moreland's Scaling the Secular City. And I devoured those books. But the interesting thing about that is I can't say that I became convinced just on the basis of those arguments. I was impressed by those arguments. I knew they were better than the other arguments that I was reading, but I didn't know what to think. I was like, well, here I have this, this much better case for the existence of God than the non-existence of God, but I don't really know what to think. Well, again, a long story short, lots of coincidences and things like that. But I remember, again, looking out at the night sky and thinking, God, if you're real, then show yourself to me and I'll follow you. And when I said that, the biggest shooting star I'd ever seen went across the sky. And I was trying to comprehend the idea that God might have just communicated with me somehow. But I was still this little skeptic, so I was getting up to go inside, and I had my hand on the door handle, and I thought, nope, it was just a coincidence. I'm not going to believe for just this coincidental, silly reason. So I looked up at the sky one more time, and another shooting star went across just as I looked up. And in that moment, I thought, okay, I'm sold. I'm not going to doubt you anymore. And I resolved later to study philosophy more seriously because I realized how important it was in my own coming to know God. Not because it convinced me, but because maybe there was an intellectual barrier that needed to be knocked down first before God could reach me in another way. And so, having studied arguments for God's existence and been convinced by those, I got interested in further topics in philosophical theology. Look, if God exists, great. What is God like? And so I started studying things like the incarnation and Trinity. And when I first started studying the Trinity, it became evident that this was a topic I couldn't leave anytime soon just because of how rich it is.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really cool story. I didn't know that about you. That's something else. That's pretty amazing. So you went to Calvin for undergrad.
Mm-hmm.
Were you sort of in that kind of like Dutch Reformed sort of wing of evangelicalism, or?
No, the church I wound up attending after I became a Christian was a non-denominational Church of Christ, and I had pretty philosophical leanings toward Arian, not Arianism,
not Arianism, Arminianism.
yeah, Arminianism. I was just gonna say libertarian free will. My brain is.
We'd be having a very different conversation if you had philosophical leanings towards Arianism.
I'm hitched to philosophical terms and maybe not always the theological terms. But no, I got this question all the time at Calvin, and I was kind of a fish out of water there too, because I rubbed shoulders with almost everyone there was Dutch Reformed Calvinists.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah.
I was attracted to Calvin just because of its august reputation in philosophy.
Literally Augustine. Yeah.
That's right.
So yeah, no, that's really cool. And so then you go from a Christian school to Cornell, and I can say from personal experience that Ithaca, New York, and Cornell University is not the most religious place on earth, and in fact, it might be one of the very opposite of that. So what was it like focusing on a lot of religious subjects in a very secular philosophy department?
I did most of that on my own time. My dissertation did wind up being almost, it was philosophy. It had intersections in philosophy of religion, obvious applications, but it was mostly just metaphysics. And I actually remember pitching to my dissertation committee a dissertation on the Trinity. I wanted to write on the Trinity. And they were just like flabbergasted. They were like, why aren't you in a theology program somewhere? Mm-hmm. I was like, oh, you guys don't realize how philosophically rich this doctrine is. And but I did wind up kind of only tangentially working on the Trinity with applications in mind later with the metaphysics I was doing. But being at Cornell and rubbing shoulders with other grad students, most of whom were not believers, I thrive in that kind of environment. I love it. I love interacting with non-Christians about these things. And so I never made an effort to hide my convictions. political or religious or philosophical. And I made a lot of good friends for that reason who were across the aisle in many respects from me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I remember that. I think that you and I are a little bit similar. I'm kind of the reverse of you. I grew up Christian, and I would hang out with the atheists and I literally hung out with the communist club in high school, not because I had any political leanings towards communism, but because they were all atheists and loved arguing with me, and they liked having me around so that they, had someone to stir up the pot or something like that, and maybe they could convince me to become a dialectical materialist or something. So I did that in high school, and then Cornell. I kind of liked. I think I'm a little bit of a contrarian by nature, and so being surrounded by people that disagree with me on matters of faith is probably better for my faith than if you surrounded me with a bunch of Christians who I agreed with. Yeah. I would have to find some way to rebel against it or something like that.
Yeah,
so
I'm the exact same way. I understand that.
So
what years were you at Cornell?
I graduated in 2011, so I was there from 2007 to 2011.
Okay, yeah, I came in at 2012, so we just missed each other.
Okay, yeah, I figured that was probably the case. So let's dig into sort of the meat of the conversation. So. The first question is why do you think there's been increasing scholarly interest in the Trinity recently? I at least certainly get that impression. I think that it was sort of neglected for a while, maybe like 100 years ago or something like that, and that it's sort of been picking up steam again. I'm curious for your impression of that and maybe some of the reasons for that.
I don't really know what's going on in the world of theology. So all I can really speak to is what's going on in philosophy. And I guess there would be growing interest in philosophy on the Trinity for several reasons. One would be that Christian philosophy in general is thriving. So Christian philosophers are enjoying a time when, for the most part, it's not professionally suspect to philosophically analyze religious topics, including classic Christian doctrines like the Trinity. So and as far as the Trinity goes, there's a lot there that can keep the philosophical wheel spinning. The Trinity, and this is what I discovered when I first started studying it philosophically. It's, you get the classic problem of the many and the one, the concept of personhood, all these metaphysical relations like identity, dependence, constitution, mereology, grounding, basic ontological categories like substance and essence. Love and friendship come into it in interesting ways. Mystery, paradox. It's got everything a philosopher would think about. So that's probably a reason. Another reason is that the doctrine of the Trinity is a classic puzzle, and philosophers love puzzles. It's a puzzle about how there can be one thing that's also, in some sense, three things. So philosophers love puzzles, and today, with how much resources there are in philosophy, with so many systems of logic, precise logical and semantic devices, fancy metaphysics, the Christian philosopher can just help himself to all of these things and apply them to the doctrine of the Trinity. It's like a kid in a candy shop. So that's another reason. Final reason would just be there's probably an obvious apologetic motive. Increased interest in the Trinity. I mean, if we can show as Christian philosophers that Christian doctrines, essential Christian doctrines, like fundamental Christian doctrines like the Trinity incarnation, are logically coherent and defensible, well, that effectively rebuts any objections to the contrary, which is very important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that if you just peruse around YouTube, the doctrine of the Trinity has sort of coming on attack on three fronts, you could say, which is ironic. There's atheists will criticize it, right? There was a recent debate between Cosmic Skeptic, the atheist, and Bishop Barron. And one of the topics that Cosmic Skeptic went after Bishop Barron on was the Trinity. I actually thought that Bishop Barron did a pretty bad job. I think he would have done a better job than him. And then Muslim apologists, of course, there's, I think, increasing I don't know, YouTube kind of apologetic interactions between Muslims and Christians. And of course, Muslims have been criticizing the doctrine of the Trinity since day one.
Yeah.
And then there's also kind of the even stranger front of Unitarian Christians putting perhaps there's something of maybe a Unitarian renaissance too. Unitarianism seems to ebb and flow, and I think we're sort of ebbing at the moment. So I think that you're right, that there is apologetic pressure on the doctrine, which is bringing it up to people's attention.
Yeah, that seems right to me. Yeah.
So what do you think are some of the ways that recent Trinitarian scholarship has fallen short? I've heard you say at least that when Trinitarians philosophize about God, they often just kind of completely ignore the doctrine of the Trinity, and then when they're philosophizing about the Trinity, they almost completely ignore all the other ways that you can think about God, almost as if it's sort of like it's compartmentalized. I wonder what your reaction to that is, and if you feel like you have any other critiques of sort of modern Trinitarian scholarship.
I think that's absolutely true. There has been this renaissance in Christian philosophy and thinking about the concept of God. So there are dozens of books that explore in very logically rigorous ways the attributes of God: omniscience, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, necessity, aseity, omnipresence. Go down the list. But every single one of these books, almost every single one of them, it's like they're exploring the concept of what goes by the term the God of the philosophers. It's sort of this generic God of a generic theism, which is a sort of unipersonal being. Now, that sort of being, that sort of God, is very different from the traditional Christian conception of God, which is tripersonal. And there's no attempt at all, or at least very, very little attempt. I'm only aware of like one article that tries to do this, and it does it like en passant. There's no attempt to try to integrate these traditional divine attributes with a thoroughgoing Trinitarian conception of God. So that's a major weakness in contemporary Trinitarian scholarship. Another one is, and I was just thinking about this, I'm part of a few groups of where people are more versed in theology than philosophy, and I asked them, I said, what's the gold standard of theology books, historical, biblical theology on the Trinity? And there isn't really one. I would really love to see someone competent in biblical studies and in systematic and historical theology write a massive tome defending the biblical basis of the Trinity, but there really isn't one. Surprisingly, there's a lot of smaller treatments here and there, but I think there's a dearth in the literature there too. And finally, I guess I'd say
that's been a mantle not taken up since Augustine's De Trinitate or something.
Pretty much. I mean, you have some smaller books, but I think you're right. And the last thing is, I think Christian philosophers need to get serious about trying to offer more rigorous and sophisticated arguments for the Trinity. To think that if God exists, God would be a Trinity in purely philosophical terms, or at least, if not specifically a Trinity of three persons, at least reasons to think that if God exists, God would be more than one person. So against Unitarianism, I think there's a lot of strategies out there that are ripe for doing that, but no one's really doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. So when you think about the doctrine of the Trinity, you say it's like a puzzle to be solved. You said earlier, how do you understand? What are the conditions what's the puzzle that needs to be solved? What are the conditions that need to be satisfied, in your view, for it to be an orthodox Trinity theory and a viable Trinity theory? Like, what are the constraints, and why? Where's the puzzle coming from?
Well, I see those as somewhat two different questions. There's a classic logical problem of the Trinity. the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. There's only one God. How does that work? Uh, and and then there's the problem of coming up with what you say. What's a viable theory of the Trinity? And I think we should be careful here because right from the start, I would want to say that Mysterianism, the view that the Trinity is inherently mysterious, I think that's viable, and I think that's orthodox, and I think that's defensible. But I wouldn't really count that as a theory of the Trinity. I would just say that's more like an epistemology of how we can be justified in believing the Trinity, even if we don't have a theory.
It's almost like an anti-theory.
Yeah, almost. But as far as theories go, a viable orthodox theory will be one that, one, is consistent with the biblical data, or at least with not wildly implausible interpretations of the biblical data. Two, it's got to respect the classic Trinitarian formula that God is three persons in one substance or being. Three, it's got to allow us to say both that there is one God and that each of the three persons is God. And then finally, it's got to be logically coherent. So those would be four conditions for any viable orthodox theory of the Trinity.
And so, sort of connected to that, well, I guess, I'm sort of, we had some agreed upon questions. I'm tempted to skip order a little bit just because it seems kind of relevant. How does that sort of fit in with history? Because, so we mentioned the Bible, because some things like, as a Unitarian, sometimes I feel like Protestant Trinitarians are like, okay, we kind of need to make sense of the Bible. We kind of need to be at least in the ballpark of the creedal statements, even if we don't necessarily give them the authoritative weight that that like the Catholics or the Orthodox might. And then we have the reformers that can help us, but we can take or leave. We can mix their ingredients together however we feel is necessary. And Unitarians are like, whoa. There was these couple hundred years, in between the creedal statements and the New Testament. And if we're not giving the creedal statements any weight, why are we interacting with them at all? For a Unitarian Protestant who's like, the earlier the theory, the better. The earlier in Christianity, the more likely it is to be true. It seems a little bit strange to us why, especially for a Protestant, it makes more sense perhaps for a Catholic or an Orthodox to say, oh, we need to constrain ourselves around sort of that kind of creedal development language from the 4th and 5th century.
Yeah. Well, I'm not a Catholic, although I do think that tradition is normative for orthodoxy in the essentials, in some of the fundamentals. I think there's liberty in the inessentials and unity in the essentials, as it said. So I do want to acknowledge authority in that respect. And I mean, think about it this way. God was concerned with the birth and the rise of his church. And for him to permit such a grave error about his being in the doctrine of the Trinity seems to me incredible. It seems to me that would be like God dropping the ball for his church right from the start. So theologically, I guess that's a reason to think that no, there is some norms of orthodoxy that did occur and occurred quite rightly in the creedal expressions, but they're philosophically imprecise enough to where I think we have some leeway in how we think of the Trinity.
Okay. So without any further ado, let's get into what your sort of solution, your proposal is for the doctrine of the Trinity. How would you describe what you put forward? Sort of, it's in your PhD thesis a little bit, but you kind of expand on it other places. What's your view of the Trinity?
Well, most basically, my view is just what orthodoxy teaches: is God is three persons in one being or substance. Everyone agrees on that. All Christians agree on that. But the question is, well, what does that mean? Well, I'm attracted to social Trinitarianism, which is the view that the persons, the three persons, have minds of their own. Each is a self-conscious moral agent. with beliefs, intentions, and the ability to act. I think that's just what a person is, or at least a certain kind of person. Anything that's a moral, free, self-conscious being is a person. And I think the three persons of the Trinity are that sort of being. Now, how are the three persons one being? Here I'm attracted to a mereological model, which sees each person.
Could you define mereological for people who aren't familiar with that?
Mereology is just the study or the logic of parts and wholes, how parts and wholes relate to each other. So mereological is just a part-whole relationship. So I think
it's not Mariology.
right. Not the
that's a different conversation.
That's right. Comes from the Greek word meros, which means part.
Yeah.
I'm attracted to a view which sees the Father, Son, and Spirit as, in some sense, parts of the whole Godhead. Now, I know a lot of philosophers and theologians bristle at this, but it's because I don't think that they've really acquainted themselves with the study of mereology. There are many different kinds of parts, and there are different ways things can have parts. So there are lots of options here. Just take a look at Peter Simmons' book, which is called Parts, to get a sense of how rich and plentiful concepts in mereology are. So I think there's some kind of part-whole relationship between the three persons and the one substance, but I'm not really sure exactly how to cash that out. What's the best way to think of that? I'm not sure. Okay, so far, nothing really original. The more unique element of my view, or at least the view I've proposed, some days I'm not really sure if it is my view, is that three persons together make up a fourth person, albeit a different kind of person, what I call a group person. So I think this view is not only the best way to counter the most troubling objections to social Trinitarianism, I also think that it may have some biblical precedent.
So it's sort of like, so the three persons are persons in sort of this modern traditional sense, right? Where we, talk about various kind of psychological aspects of what it means to be a person, what it means to be a self, and stuff like that. Because sometimes people will say, actually, person back then didn't mean what person means now, and stuff like that, and that's a debate that people go back and forth on. You're very much kind of owning and saying, yes, these are persons in that sort of psychological, self-aware, phenomenal consciousness, free will, agent kind of sense.
I want to say yes to both of those, really. I think social Trinitarians are wrong that the only viable concept of personhood is this modern concept of personhood, in a sense of being a moral agent, self-conscious, and so forth. I think that there are broader concepts of personhood that the ancients did have. So I want to take the evidence for that very seriously, as well as just run conceptual analysis on our modern, what you're calling the modern concept of personhood. And so yeah, I go on to distinguish two kinds of person.
Yeah. So that's how you don't. So because it seems like the constant problem that social Trinitarianism needs to deal with is the accusation. Well, how's that not just tritheism, right? How is it different than saying there's Zeus and Hera and Apollo and they all have the divine nature or something like that, and they all really love each other and really get along, and this is where you're sort of the two types of persons interact together to kind of allow there to be differentiation and individuation of the persons, and then this sort of kind of group person where you have two kinds of personhood that you're talking about.
Well, what makes the three persons one being, on my view, is not their relationship with each other, loving each other, or even sharing an essence. It's that they're parts of a single substance. It's that they are parts of one being. You just have one being that's got three parts. So there's only one God in the sense that there's only one composite entity that has these three parts. So I would answer in the group God, the group person stuff doesn't even come into that. How I think God is one being. I think if group agency and group personhood is a legitimate and defensible idea, I think that certain corporations, certain groups of people can be agents and possibly persons, group persons. And obviously they're not going to be unified in the same way that I imagine God is unified. Mm-hmm. So I think the question of unity is distinct and deeper than the question of the group personhood stuff that I put forward.
Sure. So yeah, let's talk about group personhood a little bit more. So you've sort of mentioned the example of corporations, like what my wife, bless her heart, is often sort of my practice for my interviews coming up, where I'll try and explain the views that my interviewees are believe, and I'll try and do my best to explain it to my wife. And if I can't explain it to my wife, then I assume that I don't understand them well enough yet. So I was trying to explain to my wife as best as I could what I thought that you believed, and I was sort of like, it's almost a little bit like, you've got the Beatles and you've got John and Paul and Ringo and George, and they're each persons, but that together they make up one bigger thing, right, which is the Beatles. And if you ask, well, who wrote Sgt. Pepper? Who made the album Sgt. Pepper's? Well, the Beatles did, right? And, they each contribute in their own way. Some of them write these songs, some of them play these instruments, some of them sing these parts and stuff like that. But there's something about the Beatles which can't just be reduced down to the 4 individual members of the Beatles, right? And it's something sort of like that when there's a certain kind of cooperation between members, something new emerges out of it. And that was sort of the best analogy that I could come up with trying to explain it to my wife.
That's a great analogy. I love it. With the exception of the Beatles, if we could just forget about them and pretend that they never existed, I think the world would be much better.
And maybe we need a 3-person band for this to be a better analogy.
No, I have a long time hatred of the Beatles that will not go away. Ooh,
yeah, that might be our actual biggest source of disagreement in this conversation.
Forget the Trinity and Trinitarianism. This is
we've got more urgent battles to have if you don't like the Beatles. No, but yeah, this sort of idea of group personhood, where there's like an agency to the Beatles, right? The Beatles are like, oh man, we need to keep putting out albums, we need to go on tour, right? And do all those sorts of things. And there's even kind of, you could even throw in their agent, and their other people are sort of contributing to this thing called the Beatles that is still not really just able to be broken down to right. John, Paul, Ringo, and George.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And if you add to that the Beatles, whatever that refers to, if you add to that they can act in morally responsible ways, or that there's a rational first-person perspective from the Beatles' perspective, where that can't be reduced to just the perspective of any of the members, then I think you've already got sufficient conditions for personhood.
Right. Because people, like when John said, hey, we're bigger than Jesus Christ, and people were burning Beatles albums, right, and stuff like that in protest of that comment, they were treating the Beatles as if they were a moral agent. Yeah, it was something John in particular said, but he said it kind of as a Beatle.
That's right.
And
on
people,
the Beatles, that's right.
And people were sort of taking out their anger at that comment, not just on John, but burning a vinyl record of the whole band and stuff like that.
Great example. I love it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And but the question is like, so the individual members of the Beatles are conscious, right? There's something that it's like to be Paul McCartney. There's something like that it's like to be John Lennon, or at least there used to be. And but there is no phenomenal consciousness that it's like to be the Beatles as a whole. How do you deal with that in sort of your group personhood model?
Well, I distinguish two kinds of persons, what I call an intrinsicist person and a functional person. An intrinsicist person is a person like you and I that meets sufficient conditions of personhood just in virtue of our own intrinsic nature, of the kinds of things that we are by nature. So examples here would be, other examples would be, I think, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. If they exist, wizards, dwarves, elves, Superman, fetuses, comatose patients, angels, demons. So all these would be, if they exist at all, would be persons by virtue of their intrinsic nature. Mm-hmm. But there's reason to acknowledge very different kinds of things that might meet sufficient conditions of personhood also. Not by what they are by nature, but just because of how they behave or function. And so I call these functional persons. And examples here would be robots. Robots one day might become sophisticated enough that they become self-aware or behave morally, or we treat them as moral agents. Another example would be is found in multiple personality disorder. So some clinicians say that multiple personality patients can have alternate personalities. These are called sometimes just shorthanded alters. Alters so robust that they're basically indistinguishable from a real separate person. But it would be crazy to see them as some kind of same kind of person as the patient is. That would be like saying if I had multiple personality disorder, there's more than one me, or more than one person just like me that's not me in me. So it makes better sense to say that in cases of multiple personality disorder, that there are multiple functional persons overlapping a single intrinsicist person. And in fact, clinicians are largely agreed that the reason alters exist, the reason people have multiple personality disorder, is to serve a certain function. They serve a certain function. They're essentially functional entities, namely that they're extremely sophisticated coping mechanisms. So alters of people who have multiple personality disorder might be another example of a functional person.
So that's sort of like the opposite direction, right?
That's right.
One intrinsicist person, right? One center of consciousness, multiple functional persons. And that's your model of the Trinity is the mirror of that, which is multiple intrinsicist persons grouping up together into a group person.
That's exactly right.
Which is a functional person, and that group person is a functional person.
Yep, you nailed it. That's right.
So what are the conditions that make something a functional person, right? We don't need to get too down the rabbit hole, but I've got my computer. I work. My day job is like working in artificial intelligence and healthcare. So I've got some AI models on my work computer, but I don't think it's quite a functional person yet. Maybe AI will get there one day, but without going too far down the rabbit hole of what AI is, what are the conditions for functional personhood?
Conditions of functional personhood are just that you meet conditions of personhood by virtue of function, and conditions of personhood just would be things like you're free, you are morally responsible, and you have a rational first-person perspective. So if you can meet those conditions in virtue of function, I think you count as a functional person. Now, and if the question is, how do we build up to a group person? Well, a group would have to meet basic conditions of agency. All persons are agents, not all agents are persons. So if there can be a group person, it also has to meet conditions of agency. And basic conditions of agency are just that you have to be able to have representational states about how the world is, motivational states about how you want the world to be, and then the ability to rationally process those states and act to get the world to match how you want it to be. That's just what an agent is. So it's a pretty low bar. I think bugs are agents. I think it's very clear that there are already robots that are agents.
Yeah, yeah. I think I have made some computer models that I would classify as agents. If they're making if the algorithm's making a decision about what medicine a patient should receive, and then that actually affects what happens in the real world, you would say, well, who is the agent who decided which medicine this patient got? Was it the doctor? Was it the nurse? No, it was actually that computer algorithm that decided which medicine the patient got.
Yeah. I would want to look deeper into that example because I'm not sure if you would get all three conditions, but I think it's very clear that certain AI bots and things like that can absolutely meet conditions of agency. I mean, a clear example would be like self-driving cars. Mm-hmm. That's a sophisticated enough AI that I think it's pretty much indisputable that that's an agent. Now,
but it doesn't have all the other attributes of personhood.
Right. So I don't think it's yet sufficient for personhood because we don't treat those as morally significant. We don't treat them as having free will, and it's unclear whether they have the sort of first-person perspective or self-consciousness that would be sufficient for personhood. And that goes to your question about how does phenomenal consciousness come into this?
Yeah.
And really it doesn't. Phenomenal consciousness is a term of art in philosophy used to refer to certain kinds of mental states of consciousness that have a sort of like felt quality or texture, like the experience or sensation of redness that I have upon seeing a rose, or a particular sensations of pain or pleasure when I stub my toe or taste a strawberry. There's something, it's like from the inside, so to speak, for me to see blue, to feel the pain of stubbing my toe, taste the sweetness of a strawberry. And it seems like whatever it is, that's accessible only to me. You can't dig around in my skull and find my sensation of blueness or my taste of strawberries. It's not going to happen. Now, how does this relate to the distinction between two kinds of persons that I'm making? Well, I don't think functional persons can have phenomenal consciousness for the simple reason that phenomenal consciousness cannot be functionally realized. There are a host of arguments in philosophy of mind that support this. So if you're curious, look up absent qualia arguments or inverted spectrum arguments. These effectively show, I think, that a purely functional analysis of mental states in terms of causal roles and relations cannot, in principle, capture the qualitative properties intrinsic to phenomenal states. It's like you're trying to get something purely intrinsic from a system that's defined in purely extrinsic terms, which can't be done.
So in other words, I can write all I want about what I think Chad feels when he listens to the Beatles, however inexplicable that is to me, that he doesn't just feel absolute bliss and, bow down at the majesty of their artistry. But I still cannot understand what it's like to be inside your head when you listen to the Beatles and somehow don't enjoy it. So that sort of thing. So I guess for a group person to be a functional person, right? So it needs to have agency. And the thing about a group person, like again, thinking about the Beatles, is that it can make decisions because it can use the agency of its intrinsic persons, right? So they can have a powwow. All four members of the Beatles can have a powwow and decide that, all right, what do you think the title of our next album should be? Okay, we're going to name our next album this. We all agree? Great. We've made an agent-based decision. The Beatles have made a decision using the agency of its members, or they can put one person in charge, like their agent can be in charge of booking their tour schedule or something like that, right? Where the group person, even though it's not itself phenomenally conscious and doesn't have agency sort of in itself, it has individual members that do have the capability of agency that are sort of operating on its behalf. Would you say that that's...
Yeah, absolutely right. And a group agent or a group person acts through its members. Its members are its hands and feet and mouth, so to speak. That's right.
Yeah. And we'll get later to kind of, maybe some biblical examples of this idea, but I think that you're absolutely right. So So agency is one of the things, right? And then moral responsibility. We kind of already talked about that in, like, people being mad that John Lennon said the Beatles are bigger than Jesus Christ, right? And you could sue the Beatles, right? If the Beatles make a song that's too similar to some other band's song, then that band can sue the Beatles for copyright infringement and stuff like that and seek damages, right? So it's perfectly easy to understand how a group person can be morally responsible, because our legal system does that all the time.
Yeah. And I don't want to say that these group persons are mere legal fictions either. I want to say that they are actually meeting conditions of personhood.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a real sense in which they are real persons, not just personae fictae. So yeah, I want to be a realist about this and not an anti-realist about group persons.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's see here. I think that do you have anything else that you want to say about group personhood before we sort of move on to some of our other topics?
I want to say just that, well, we'll probably talk a little bit more about this later, but I want to give some reasons. It sounds crazy to us now because we have this concept of personhood, this pre-theoretic concept of personhood that's so narrow that the concept of group personhood just seems to be a contradiction in terms. So I want to work up. We'll probably do this in a bit, but I want to work up. I want to make the concept of group personhood a little bit more plausible. But I'm curious. You mentioned you ran the example by your wife. How did she react?
Oh, that's nice, honey. No, like what she normally says. No. I think she kind of got it. I think that well, I mean, I promise not to talk too much about my wife on these things, but she used to be a Trinitarian and is now sort of a Unitarian. But I don't want to derail us too quickly on this, but she's like, yeah, but it doesn't seem like, even if I understand the idea of like group persons like the band, the Beatles or something like that, or even like, the government of the United States or whatever, it just doesn't seem like God is a that. It seems like I need God to be something more like the, intrinsic person than just a functional person. So yeah. I think that was something of her objection.
I think I share that intuition, which is actually the intuition that drove me to the view, because it is so natural to think about and relate to God as a person, to ask for his forgiveness, to praise him for his creation, and so forth. I mean, and
reading scripture, God seems like a single person that does things and seems as if it's an intrinsicist person being described.
That's right. And so I totally feel that intuition that we need a way of making sense of how to relate to God as a person. And I think group personhood gets us there. I think it gets us. It does enough.
Yeah. So let's talk about some kind of examples from the Bible, or at least the worldview of the New Testament and stuff like that, to kind of help defend the realness of group personhood.
So I mentioned that there may be biblical precedent for this, and I was pretty shocked to discover this when I first started doing research on this. Well, back in the 1930s, a scholar by the name of H. Wheeler Robinson wrote a very influential pair of essays, which later got collected into, a book called Corporate Personality in Ancient Israel, where he argued that the ancient Hebrew thought and language is suffused with the idea that groups could literally have a consciousness of their own, which their members could then represent as spokespersons of the group, of this group consciousness. He called this corporate personality. And he argued that corporate personality underlies a whole host of biblical concepts, and it falls out of the Hebrew anthropology of what they believed human beings to be like. So here's some examples. They believed that a human personality, a human person, their person could be extended beyond their bodily locale to other times and places and things. So the invocation of a person's name, for instance, was thought to literally invoke that person's presence. So ownership of goods is another example. They seem to believe that things somehow literally bore their owner's personhood in some sense. And a nice example of this is Achan's, I call it Achan's plunder blunder, when he stole booty from the sack of Jericho. Well, his whole family and everything he owned was destroyed. All things associated with him were destroyed because they believed that they too, in some sense, bore his guilt. His personality was somehow extended to these other people and things. So they believed that there was just more to Achan than just the individual man, Achan. Same belief underlies blood guilt, levirate marriage, making covenants with nations and future generations. All of these things presuppose the extension of an individual's personhood across time and things and other people. So I think there are other clues in the Bible that the ancients had a broader concept of personhood than we do. And this comes in passages, H. Wheeler Robinson goes through some of these passages where the subject, the author, switches from the first person singular, I, me, to plural, like we, us. And it's like really confusing. You know, it's like when he noted this, I read some of these passages and I was like, wow, I never really noticed that. And maybe one of the clearest examples is
let us. Oh, okay, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say the "let us make" passage, man in our image, and then it switches back to the singular when God then goes and makes everything.
That's right.
And there's a whole bunch of that's its own rabbit trail, but that's at least one prominent example.
Yeah.
But you said there was one that you had in mind from the New Testament.
Yeah. If your listeners are interested in just chasing down some of these references, Genesis 49, Deuteronomy 29. Isaiah 22, Psalm 44. Look up those as examples where the author switches from a singular to plural, and then back again in some cases with no concern for inconsistency. But a very clear example of this is in Mark 5 when Jesus casts out the demons and he asks what the demon's name is, and the demon replies, "I am Legion, for we are many." Right? So it's like this like singular plural duality going on here that suggests this, we're not dealing with just a single individual. And of course, there are many descriptions of the church in the New Testament in both singular and plural terms as well. And the virtue of a corporate personality model or interpretive device is that we don't need to treat these as mere metaphors. We can say that the church herself is a corporate personality. And several of these themes come together when Paul says, you are all one person in Jesus Christ, and because of that, Adam's seed, we are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise, and that's in Galatians. So we moderns would do well to not hastily interpret such language in a non-literal and metaphorical way, if they had this concept of corporate personality that Robinson thinks they had. Now that we're all talking. Those are mostly examples about like persons not being understood in this very individualistic sense. Well, a scholar by the name of Aubrey Johnson came along and said, "Well, no, there are examples in the Bible where this applies to divine beings too," and so he wrote this book called "The One and the Many in the Israelite Conception of God," and he argues that the messianic figure of Daniel 7 and the suffering servant of Isaiah are both corporate personalities. And he even discusses a cuneiform inscription that depicts the deity Baal as a kind of unholy trinity that's both three in one. It's very interesting. So,
well, Unitarians might use that for a slightly different purpose, but yeah, I know what you're talking about. But I think another, to help kind of bolster up some other examples, like powers, principalities and powers, right? I think when Paul's talking about that are a very similar idea. Like you can imagine, like we know that in their worldview at the time, they sort of thought of nation states as something like, corporate persons that that might even have like an angel, or perhaps even a demonic angel at sort of the top of it, right? And that, the nation of Persia or something like that was sort of this group person that was kind of maybe represented in the spiritual realm by like, the prince of Persia. You can see that in the Old Testament and stuff like that, when like Michael the archangel shows up and he's like, well, why are you late, Michael? And Michael's like, oh, I was wrestling with the prince of Persia. And, most people don't think that that was a human being that he was talking about. But there's this sort of sense, even through time, that, whoever's the human king of Persia will come and go, and Persia, is like hundreds of thousands or millions of people, but there's sort of like this spiritual singular entity person that's sort of kind of like the power behind the scenes, and that the people of Persia are participants in the principality of Persia. And that when Paul says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against, principalities, powers, and et cetera, et cetera. I think that you're absolutely right, that there's something, that this idea that there are entities that are very real, right? That are, it's like you were talking earlier, like in our legal system, we treat corporations as persons, but sometimes we kind of think that that's like a pretend thing to do. I don't think that Paul thought that the principalities and powers were pretend. In fact, I think he actually thought it was like more real, right? That if you didn't know that, and if you didn't understand that, you were missing out on the reality of the situation. The reality of the situation was these principalities and powers operating in our world, and you can be a participant in the good ones or the bad ones, and you need to wake up and know which ones you're interacting with.
That's exactly right. And if you want to go deep on that theme, look at Walter Wink's trilogy. I think it's just called the Powers trilogy, where he's got 3 different books where he explores this concept of principalities and powers as it operates in the Bible. And he stopped short of saying that they are corporate personalities, but it's hard to not come away from his study thinking, wow, these are these corporate spirits or corporate personalities that embody institutions, which can be for good, or it could be for ill.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think that you're right, that this isn't just this new fancy contemporary philosophical concept that we've conjured up to solve an ancient problem, but that I really do think that in the worldview of the Bible, Old Testament and New, that there is something like this idea, and that they, I think, treated it as more real, right, than often is easy for us modern people to do.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I'm going to say, let's go back to try to put our mindset more in the mindset of the ancients when we think about the Trinity, which was open to this broader concept of personhood, which then opens the door to God, the Trinity, being a group person.
Mm-hmm. And so this is probably where we disagree. Like I'm willing to go as far as saying that I think that you're right, that the biblical authors, the biblical worldview had these ideas and these sorts of things, and I think that you're putting these pieces together, like I said kind of before we had the recording on, is more convincing than any of the social Trinitarians that I've ever heard before. I think that you're connecting these dots in a really kind of coherent and convincing way, but I think that there are some problems that you still have to deal with, and so I think we'll move on to sort of some of the challenges that this view might have. So my first question to you, I'm sort of getting from Trey Brickley, is a member of the Trinity's Facebook group, and he had some interaction with William Lane Craig through his website or something like that. And so I think that this is something, I don't think that Trey is completely original in this, but he did a really good job articulating it. And your view is similar to William Lane Craig. It has some differences, right? You guys are both kind of doing a partialist thing, but you're doing sort of a social group person partialist thing. And William Lane Craig almost seems to imagine some sort of like spiritual sinew or something like that ties the persons of the, he views substance as something more, I don't know, concrete or something like that.
I go for that too, and we'll talk about that, I think, in a minute.
Okay, but so one of the problems, or one of the questions for sort of a partialist view is, the counting gods, right? So you mentioned earlier, way back when I asked you what are the conditions of a Trinity theory, that we need to have one God out of this, right? That's what we need to be monotheists, right? That's one of the conditions. And so it would seem then that you would have to say that only the group person is a god, and that the individual persons are therefore not gods. They might be God in a qualitative sense in terms of what they are, but you could not say that God the Father is a God, because he is just one of the members, one of the persons that makes up the one God. So how would you deal with that objection? And the other part of the objection is like Jesus seems to call his Father a God multiple times. Like I could pull out a whole bunch of quotes, but let's just say that the New Testament presents at least God the Father as a God.
Okay, so I think there are two ways a social Trinitarian can go about answering this. But before I give those answers, I want to say that our language can be really tricky here, and it would be a mistake to read metaphysics off the surface of our language, and all the more so off the surface of translations from ancient languages. So and I'd be happy to grant that the New Testament authors did not have a theory of the Trinity, and so they couldn't have adopted precise linguistic practices that reflected a theory of the Trinity. Now, that being said, they actually did adopt certain linguistic practices that signaled what I think of as like Trinitarian glimmerings. For instance, they chose to refer to Jesus. I'm sure you know this, and you have your alternative explanation, but they chose to refer to Jesus predominantly with kurios, Lord, and in some cases applied the Old Testament references to Yahweh to him. Mm-hmm. And they chose to refer to God the Father predominantly with ha theos. And they
the God in Greek, in case people,
they're not 100% consistent in that, but it's a dominant pattern in the New Testament. Well, they also employed, as a matter of course, it seems, triadic formulae, closely linking Christ, God the Father, and the Holy Spirit in high offices. And there's at least maybe 7 or
6,
8
something,
in the New Testament where this occurs. So we have to be careful about what we can and can't infer just based on the language that the New Testament authors use. And I'm sure you'd agree with that. But the main point I want to make is that before answering the question, it's just that the language in the New Testament is imprecise enough that I think we have considerable philosophical leeway in how we go about constructing a theory of the Trinity, or answering your main question, especially a theory that all hangs on just the use of an indefinite article, a God, right? So I think we have some leeway here. That being said, back to your question, if only the group person is the one God, or only the Trinity is the one God, how can the individual persons of the Trinity be considered a God? Well, let me give you 2 examples.
Or it's even a little harder than that. If only the group person can be considered a God, right? I'm not just saying the God, but a God.
A God, okay.
Right. Then it would seem that you couldn't let the 3 members be a God, or else you would have 3 or possibly even 4 gods.
That's right. So I want to give 2 examples, and they're not consistent, but I think either one is open to the social Trinitarian. So take The Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings as a story, as a whole. It's a trilogy, but it's also like one story, right? In a deeper sense, it's just one story. So suppose we bind together the Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, and the Return of the King together as just one book. We slap them together between two covers as one volume. Now, is the Bound trilogy a Lord of the Rings book? Yes, right?
Yes.
In fact, it is the Lord of the Rings proper, right? It's
Yes.
It's all three of them together. Now, is the Fellowship of the Ring a Lord of the Rings book?
Yes.
Yes. Two Towers? Yes. Return of the King? Yes.
Two Towers is a little boring sometimes, though. I'm not sure.
So, you've got 4 books, do you? Well, no. You just have one book. You have the Lord of the Rings. You don't get 4 books just because we've slapped 3 of them together. Each can be considered a separate book, just in virtue of being part of the Lord of the Rings proper, the trilogy. But I don't think in virtue of slapping them together into one book, we thereby have 4 books. So how would you respond to that?
So it would seem that I smell whiffs of equivocation or something like that. Because, a book is also divided in chapters, right? So I could print out one chapter of the Fellowship of the Ring and bind it. And is that a Lord of the Rings book? Well, it is a book, and it is part of Lord of the Rings and stuff like that. And so seemingly you could, subdivide and subdivide and subdivide ad infinitum, a paragraph, a sentence, I could print out one sentence and bind it, and then it would be a Lord of the Rings book. And I guess I'm not sure what my objection point is with that, but it seems like we're using 2 different definitions of book.
Okay, yeah. Well, I think you're right that there is equivocation going on. But your point there just seemed to be more about the arbitrariness of carving it up into 3 books, and that's just an artifact of the example. I don't think
Right.
that's really the real concern. I think you're more on point in noticing that there's an equivocation. I'll come back to that. Here's a second example. I drew you a picture, Sam, the other day. Now here it is. This is Zorg. Okay. You see how he's got 3 faces?
Mm-hmm.
All right. He's got 3 faces. Zorg here, he's got 3 minds. And this is a being. He's a unique being. He's the only being of his kind. And let's just call it a Zorg. It's the only Zorg there is. So not only is Zorg a Zorg, Zorg is a Zorg. It's like the name is what he is. So Zorg is both a kind term, insofar as it makes sense to talk about things that there's only one kind of a thing, and it's also a proper name. Zorg is also a proper name. So Zorg has 3 minds. So one goes, they all go. Now we can address each of the minds of Zorg. We could say, let's just call them Zorgon, Zorgus, and Zorgu, and we can call all 3 of them together Zorgrate. Okay. Now, is Zorgrate a Zorg?
Well, yes, and this is sort of like, and this is where I would say, what if we use something like, if we use cat, right? And so this is where I feel like the equivocation gets hammered out a little bit more clearly. Like, let's say I've got a cat, and I chop it up in 3 parts, right? I kill the cat, I skin the cat, which there are many ways to do, and then I make 2 other parts, right? And if I bring you the skin of a cat, is it a cat? Well, no, it's not a cat, but it's feline, right? It's not a dog skin, it's not a bird skin, it's not a rug, it's feline, but it's not a cat, right?
That's right. Now, the reason I went with Zorg, this sort of unique being, is because I want to get away from there being more than one instances of a kind, like there are cats. So if we say Zorgrate, the collection of all 3 of the minds is a Zorg, we'll say yes. Now, what about the individuals, like Zorgon? Is Zorgon a Zorg? No, he's not. He's part of a Zorg, right? And so we would say, no, there's only one Zorg. But at the same time, if I were talking to Zorgon, I don't see anything wrong with addressing Zorgon simply as Zorg, because in addressing Zorgon, I'm in a sense addressing this whole being, this one being, because they're all connected. So both of these examples, the Lord of the Rings and the Zorgon example, they require different metaphysics, and they require acknowledging something like the distinction between the is of identity and the is of predication. But I take it that they're defensible and they're coherent options. And notice that the group personhood stuff doesn't even really come in here. That's sort of auxiliary to my answer to the initial question.
Right. And kind of going back to the Beatles, right? If I meet Paul McCartney and I talk with Paul McCartney, I have not met the Beatles, but he is a Beatle. And like seemingly, well, now it's like impossible to meet the Beatles, but let's imagine, we go back to the 60s and all four of them are alive. Mm-hmm. I could meet the Beatles if I met all four of them, and I could talk to the Beatles if I, sort of am addressing them as a group. I can see the Beatles if they perform together as a band, but if I go watch Paul McCartney do a solo performance, I've not met the Beatles. And it would seem to be the case with the Trinity then, that if I meet Jesus and I interact with Jesus, I haven't met God. I have met Jesus, who is God qualitatively, but I haven't met the group person God. I could maybe Jesus could be acting on behalf of the group person, right? And Jesus is sort of a perfectly, faithful representative. And so I could maybe address the group person by only addressing Jesus, right? Because I could trust that he would be doing a good enough job to represent the other two members not present. But there's a certain sense in which he isn't God. There's a sense in which he is God and a sense in which he's not.
Well, there's a sense in which we can say he's God, and the sense in which he is God,
right?
And I think that's enough. I think when we meet Jesus, we meet God. We meet the group God through Jesus. Jesus as an essential part of that group. Thereby meeting one part of the group, you meet an essential part of the group as a whole. And especially, here's where we can bring in other characteristics of the Trinity that where the individual persons of the Trinity share all the essential attributes. And so by virtue of meeting one, you have met, well, in a sense, you've met all three. You've encountered the divinity of all three, but you might not have met the personhood of all three.
Right, and that's what makes the Trinity a little bit different than the Beatles, is sort of this shared essence, right, that you could see in one of them, and then that's the same essence that all of them have. Yeah. And it would be the closest equivalent, like with the Beatles example, is like, well, I know what human nature is like because I've met Paul McCartney, but that's true of all humans, right, or something like that. But the members of the Trinity are a little bit more tightly bound up than sort of the Beatles example. So yeah, I feel like really the only way out is to fess up to a little bit of equivocation, and then use something like agentival representation through one of the persons, such that it is actually allowed for you to say God the Father is my God, or something like that, even though there's also a sense in which God the Father isn't a God solo or something.
That's right. Yeah, and we can play with language here depending on how we want to carve up the metaphysics. And I mean, just be careful with the word equivocation. I know equivocation can be an informal fallacy, but informal fallacies are not always fallacies. Just because there's more than one way, there's more than one meaning of the word is, that doesn't mean it's always fallacious. It's only fallacious in certain contexts. So I totally acknowledge that there's equivocation, but I would deny that it's a fallacious sort of equivocation.
Yeah, sure. Right, right. I mean, human language is like that, that words have multiple meanings. You just have to own up to it and not be smuggling foolery when you do that. Yeah, but it's still, the question remains is even in that sort of like God the Father is a member of the Godhead, and so therefore you can think of him as your God, even though he individually isn't a God. I guess the question is if that really feels faithful to the biblical presentation. And I don't know, maybe that's a bigger question for a different time, but that's sort of the lingering question that I feel. So I guess, so we've kind of touched on this, but what differentiates the members of the Trinity? It seems like you might be running the risk of tying them so closely together that you wouldn't have the ability to make them distinct from each other. So how do you distinguish them?
Very simply, just by their having distinct minds. So ad intra, as theologians would want to say, ad intra, what distinguishes persons is their minds. Ad extra, how we ourselves can distinguish the persons would be by their roles in creation, would be by their relationship to creation.
So their basically their economic operations would be kind of the more kind of old school way of saying, the Augustinian and even pre-Augustinian way of doing that. Okay, so here's some questions. So why do the different members of the Trinity relate to creation differently? Like, why is it the Holy Spirit that's the one that gives inspiration to the prophets? Why is it the Son that becomes incarnate? Why is it the Father that, I don't know, mans the fort back up in heaven while the other two are running around doing things?
I have no idea. I have no idea why the second person of the Trinity, as opposed to the first and third, became incarnate. But I don't see any problem in saying that the first or third persons of the Trinity might have become incarnate instead. I imagine that these sorts of decisions of what role each person of the Trinity plays or assumes in relation to creation, I don't imagine them as being necessitated by their nature or their relationship to each other. I imagine them as being purely voluntary. And who knows why or how they decided just what they did. I mean, can anyone know that apart from like special divine revelation?
And this is where I'd say that you're a little bit different from like old school 4th and 5th century Trinitarians who might often, or even some of like the I guess you could say proto-Trinitarians, like, people like Irenaeus or something, or Origen or something like that, would have had clear answers to that sort of thing. Like Irenaeus and Justin Martyr will say, well, obviously the Father would never leave, super celestial heaven and come down. That's his, that's what's special about him, is he sits up there. Yeah. And so obviously it's the Son's job to be the intermediary. And, I think that they imagined that there were things true about them that we could know that made it a natural fit for them to have the different jobs that they do. Yeah. And it seems like you might be lacking that a little bit compared to some of those that earlier, I don't know, 2nd through 5th century view.
That's right. And I think the resources that they had for going deeper on this question is that they held to ontological processions. Mm-hmm. And I reject that. So
you reject processions. All right.
And an ontological generation of the Son. I reject that as well.
Interesting. So the relationships. So like we've talked about. So there's this distinction between the economic Trinity, which is basically how we see the persons interacting, kind of in their relation to creation, basically. And then there's the immanent Trinity, which is, you could say, what the Trinity sort of is in itself. Like it's a little bit crude to say it. It's like what the Trinity appears on earth and what the Trinity is in heaven. That's right. But that's basically the general idea. So you would say in the immanent Trinity there are there's relations between the persons, but the relations don't have a type. It's just a sheer relation. Like the Father has a relation to the Son, but we're not going to call it generation or begetting or something like that.
I want to say that in the immanent Trinity, the relation between Father, Son, and Spirit, it's all mutual. I would reject an asymmetric ontological dependence relation between the Father and the Son.
Interesting.
So the Son does not eternally, in his own nature, or the Father does not eternally in his nature beget the Son in such a way that the Son ontologically depends on the Father, but not vice versa. And you could say the same thing about however you think the Spirit gets spirated.
So there are no asymmetric relations. There are only symmetric relations of fellow Trinity memberhood or something like that between the three persons. But there isn't the traditional and I'm using traditional because like Eastern Orthodoxy, right? You know, there's God the Father who is sourced in himself, who's autotheos, and then he begets the Son and breathes out or spirates the Spirit. Right, and then the Latins will say, but then also the Son also breathes out the Spirit because we need to have three sides to our triangle instead of like a two-legged stool with the Father on top or something like that. And that's in the immanent Trinity, not in the economic Trinity.
If you reject those sorts of relations in the immanent Trinity, then you can't answer the question of why the Son became incarnate by appealing to his begottenness, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So
in what sense is the Son begotten from the Father?
I think that's economic language.
So it's in the incarnation that Jesus is begotten and not prior to the incarnation.
I think that's right. Yeah.
That's actually a strange thing that we agree upon, right? That's actually something that Unitarians and your kind of Trinity theory would agree upon, is the begottenness being referring to Jesus's humanity.
Yeah, I think that's right. The special relationship he had with the Father while incarnate.
Interesting. So would you be able to recite the Nicene Creed, just out of curiosity? Because it says begotten before all ages.
Begotten, not made. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how that squares with the Nicene Creed, I'm not sure. But yeah, I the Nicene creeds, the creeds in general, the ecumenical creeds, are not going to be, the letter of those creeds is not going to be determinative of my philosophical theory of the Trinity.
Sure. Okay. So let's hear. Man, there's a couple. I'm like tempted to go in two different directions at once. I'll just say, it seems to me that this is a particular difficulty for your view, is that even the early Trinitarians didn't think that. I don't know if there's anyone in, say, the first 500 years besides maybe a modalist who I'm sure you would consider heretical for being too, I don't know, modalistic, basically, that would believe in the Trinity but deny the processions. And in fact, really, it's almost as if the development of the doctrine of the Trinity is the development of the doctrine of the processions. And it's really like the Trinity was the afterthought. The Trinity was the name for the things that were proceeding from each other. But the real meat and potatoes of the doctrinal development was the Son begotten before all ages? Was he created and not caused? Was he caused but not created? All of those sorts of things. And that's what they were arguing about. So it doesn't seem to me like you can point to anyone in the first 500 years and say, yes, they got it right. And then it's a very strange view if the true doctrine of the Trinity doesn't show up for 1900, 2000 years.
Well, by true doctrine of the Trinity, I would just keep it broad to say that there are three divine persons in one substance or being. Now that is right there in all the fathers.
I see.
But why were they so concerned about these relations between the Father, Son, and Spirit? And what drove them to tinker with how these relationships are conceived? Well, I think one of the main reasons was a sort of a beginning of perfect being theology. They rejected the idea that the Son was created, for example, because God could not be created. That's a perfect being theology methodology working in here. And I have the same exact perfect being theology in the background of why I reject processions. I don't think that you can have processions with. I don't think a perfect being, a God. I don't think God, a divine being, could be asymmetrically dependent on another being for his existence. So I think that's a perfect being consideration is going to drive a rejection of ontological processions.
Interesting. And so part of your answer to the historical question is to broaden up the definition of acceptable Trinitarian, where you could include Gregory of Nazianzus and Augustine and Thomas Aquinas, even if they have asymmetric immanent relations in the Trinity.
Yeah.
And so you say, yeah, they're Trinitarian in my definition, and so yeah, there's historic Trinitarians in early Christianity, even if I disagree with them on the non-essential details of what the Trinity is. I agree with them on the essential details of what the Trinity is.
That's right.
And my point is, I'm not sure if they would return the favor to you, and so that's a particular difficulty that you might have. But we can move on. So I feel like you still have a little bit of a problem with this sort of, how do I articulate this? If all of the members of the Trinity have perfectly symmetrical relations to each other, and they all share an essence, and all of their traits are essential traits, right? And maybe this connects with divine simplicity, and this is sort of the next question on our list, is if all of the persons of the Trinity have all of their traits essentially, right? It's not like person one gets to have some individual traits from their person oneness, and person two has individual traits from their person two-ness, and person three, etc. They all just have the traits of the divine essence. It seems like you get into this weird thing where they would collapse into each other, right? Where there is nothing differentiating them, and that if there's nothing that differentiates them, how can you say that there's three?
I think you're confusing essence with what philosophers call quiddity or a haxeity. Now,
you're going to have to define those words for me.
Okay, an essence is just the set of a thing's essential properties.
Sure.
So having an essence is not enough to explain how the Trinitarian persons can be one being. You and I and all men have the same essence. The essence of man, Aristotle said, is rational animal. But that's not enough to explain. I mean, we're not one being in virtue of having.
Right. But we have accidental traits, right? You went to Calvin for undergrad. I went to Cornell for undergrad. You were born on your birth date. I was born on my birth date. You're over there. I'm over here, right? We have accidental traits.
Oh yeah, and I think each person of the Trinity has accidental traits as well.
Okay. So
yeah, but as far as the quiddity or haxeity goes, apart from our essence, what would make me the person I am and you the person you are, despite us having the same essence, rational animal, is your quiddity or haxeity. It's sometimes translated thisness. What is this about me that's not about you? And here I think the answer is just our mind. You have humans, there are several things. You have your own body, I have my body. We have other characteristics. But most essentially, I think it's our minds. I think the same thing is true of the Trinity. So if you're asking what makes the divine persons one being, it's going to be that they're essential parts of one being. But if you're asking what individuates one divine person from another, I would just say it's their mind.
So do they have accidents? Are there accidental individuating traits in the immanent Trinity, or is it only relational to creation?
That's a good question. I'm inclined to say that yes, there are accidental traits of each mind, that individual, that concern to make each mind unique. I mean, it's always, you always hesitate to kind of apply human characteristics or attributes to the Trinity, but I can imagine each person of the Trinity having their own sense of humor, having their own like aesthetic preferences or tastes, or I don't know.
But it would seem like there would need to be a reason for their different traits, and that's where, like, Gregory of Nazianzus, who would have asymmetrical causal relations between the Trinity, members of the Trinity, could say that it was by nature of that, right? The Son is the Son because he's eternally generated from the Father, and not vice versa, right? And then there's perhaps some traits that come along with sonhood that make him fit to be the one that becomes incarnate, but it seems like you don't have the resources for that. So what's the explanation for the accidental individual traits of the members of the immanent Trinity?
So there are two ways you could think about it. You could just say, look, it's just the nature of a person that they have a unique mind and personality. Better would be to say the Spirit is what the Father and Son jointly ground.
Mm-hmm.
And it's unique for that reason, for being what the Father and Son jointly ground. The Father is what the Spirit and the Son jointly ground.
Mm-hmm.
The Son is what the Father and the Spirit jointly ground. So each person is the unique combination of the other two. So you could say that you could get some differences there.
But then it still begs the question of, why was that one the Father, why is that one the Son, and why is that one the Spirit? It's almost like that has to just be a brute fact or something like that.
I don't know that.
Because it's sort of like you're saying that the relationships are by virtue of the fatherness, sonness, and spiritness, or something like that.
Well, Father and Son.
But you wouldn't call them Father and Son, maybe
No.
even in the immanent Trinity.
No, I think those are economic terms. But that doesn't mean that they're not unique persons. With their, let's just say, with their own sense of personality, aesthetic taste, and so forth.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we could maybe move on, but I have to say, I feel like there's some difficulties there. That
Probably, yeah, there probably are, or if not difficulties, just
some future work to be done.
reason to go deeper. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So kind of moving on. So what are your biggest objections to Christian Trinitarianism? You know Dale Tuggy quite well. You've sort of interacted with his work. He's interacted with your work and stuff like that. So unlike many of my guests who have never really heard of biblical or Christian Unitarianism before, you have the benefit of having a lot of exposure to it. What do you find lacking about Christian Unitarianism?
Everything. Biblical, historical, theological, and philosophical. I mean, we could run down the list. And now my strength is not biblical studies, so I don't really want to go there, because
Sure.
I mean, I probably wouldn't get the better of that. It's not my wheelhouse. But if I were to, I would draw from some of the usual suspects, like Gerald O'Collins. His book on the Trinity is very good. Larry Hurtado, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Richard Bauckham.
Yeah. Man, I was trying to reach out to Larry Hurtado. Like, he was on my list of people to invite on my show. He passed away like last year.
I had the pleasure of briefly corresponding with him while I was a grad student, and I was very sad to learn of his passing.
Yeah, because it's funny. There are passages in his book that are like, Larry Hurtado, I think we're right. I think you see it. I think you are papering over it, but I think you see it.
Yeah.
But I love Larry Hurtado's writing. I've learned a lot from him.
I mean, I would draw on these sources, but I wouldn't obviously treat them uncritically. I think Dale has got some very good points in response to Bauckham's identity thesis and so forth, that a philosopher could sharpen up and make use of nonetheless. But so that's the biblical area and sort of how I would approach that. Historically, like I said earlier, while I'm not a Catholic, I think history of dogma is normative in some sense. major deviations from fundamental theology need to be justified. Theologically, I think there are three reasons here. One is that, I guess I already mentioned this, is that I believe God guides his church and was especially intimate in the process early on when these foundational doctrines were codified. And to think that the Trinity is just a historical mistake would require us to have a pretty low of God's providence of his church, God's providential guidance of his church. Another theological reason would be that everyone agrees that God the Father, and even Unitarians would agree with that God the Father and the man Jesus Christ are distinct persons, right?
Yes.
It's just that Unitarians maintain that Jesus wasn't God. Well, it seems to me that Jesus must have been divine in order to atone for sin. No mere man could have been sinless and bore the fullness of God's divine wrath, the Father's divine wrath for sin. So I think Anselm is right that in order for atonement to be efficacious, it takes a God-man. It takes a God-man for that. My final theological reason, I'll let you kind of react to those, would be, once again, we are made in the image of God. We're social beings, and so probably God is a social being. And to buttress that point, I would appeal to philosophical arguments that suggest certain properties are essentially social.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I'll kind of respond to I'll respond to those three things in order. The first one, sort of like the how could God have let his church, so much of his church, go so wrong on an important question, right? That's sort of objection number one. And first off, I'll say perfectly valid, perfectly good question that I think many Christian Unitarians, Biblical Unitarians wrestle with, right? Like, I wish that they're like, say, if Eastern Orthodoxy or the Catholic Church had remained, in my view, right, Unitarian, like, and that, there were a billion Christian Unitarians, I would be like, great, that seems like a better course of history, in my view, than what actually happened. Right. And if there was even if there was some weird, I don't know, imagine the Azerbaijani Orthodox Church or something that doesn't exist had somehow broken off from the other Orthodox churches and had perfect apostolic succession or something like that, and had, remained itself, Christian Unitarian since the early days or something like that, I would be like, great, time to become Azerbaijani Orthodox or something like that. So all that to say is that you have a point. So, but how would I respond to that in a couple ways? One, I think that strangely, Christian Unitarians often think that this is not an essential trait of Christianity, right? You were sort of saying, yeah, okay, Gregory of Nazianzus believes in asymmetrical processions. I don't believe in asymmetrical processions, but he still believes in the Trinity. So you have some non-essential disagreements, but you essentially agree on, one substance, three persons. And so right, you have your definition of essential and your definition of non-essential. I think that Christian Unitarians will say that Trinitarians don't have an essential difference from us, right? We have a non-essential disagreement. We don't have an essential disagreement, and that we view you as Christians, even if you often don't return the favor to us. And so we could say it's not like the Christian faith hasn't been around this whole time. It's just been wrong on some of the non-essentials this whole time, and we're trying to correct some of the non-essentials, right? And so that's one way of us interacting with it. It's not like there was a time when there wasn't Christians, and now all of a sudden we've resurrected Christianity in the Protestant Reformation or something after 1,000 years of dormancy or something like that. We're resurrecting what we view as true doctrines within Christianity, and all Protestants think that, right? All Protestants think that there was a period of time, maybe 1,000 years or more, where serious things were wrong, and that we're correcting them back to a more correct prior state. And so Christian Unitarians just think that the Trinity or even Unitarianism is not an essential quality of Christianity.
Yeah, that just to say that the divinity of Jesus is not an essential Christian belief kind of strains credulity, I think.
Well, and that's the sort of thing. It depends who you ask. I think Gregory of Nazianzus would say, "You don't think the Son was begotten before all ages? And you call yourself Trinitarian? That's strange credulity." And Catholics, you don't think the Pope is the seat of Peter, or something like that. Christianity has this weird thing where there are all of these competing definitions of what's an essential trait of a Christian, and all of us draw lines that seemingly exclude a whole bunch of us. And us Christian Unitarians are like, okay, guys, let's just loosen things up a little bit here.
There are more and less. Yeah, I grant that point. I mean, people draw lines in crazy ways, but there are more and less plausible ways to draw the lines.
Fair enough.
Yeah, fair enough. I take the point.
And then the other point would be like, this isn't unique to the Christian era that seemingly most of the people get most of it wrong. Like in the Old Testament, it's constantly the case that most of Israel is seemingly practicing idolatry, or even in like the Exodus in the desert, huge numbers of the people that were in the presence of Moses that had seen the miracles and stuff like that are not believing and not cooperating. It just seems to be a chronic human trait of the core trueness of the faith being held by a few, and that just seems to be the way that God works through history, and that in the Old Testament it doesn't seem any different than in the Christian era, that there are large numbers of people who get it wrong, and that despite God having the chosen people of Israel, they're still venturing off into all sorts of errors constantly.
You don't see a major difference in how God related to his people in the Old Testament and how he relates to his people in the New Testament?
I'm not saying that there isn't a difference between the covenants. I'm just saying that a feature that seems to be shared is that large numbers of people can go astray. Like, why did God let Islam take over most of the heartland of the Christian, where Christianity was from, right? Well, I mean, you and I have that shared trait in common to answer for that, right? Why is seemingly huge chunks of North America abandoning going to church at the moment, right? Why is Europe turning its back on its Christian past? There are all these sorts of questions.
Those would be much more pressing questions, I think, yeah.
Right, and so why did a huge number of Christians start thinking that God was 3 in 1, is in my list of things that are in that same category of questions, but it doesn't seem any more particularly difficult than many of the other ones.
And what was your reaction to the...
So that's my objection to question 1, right? I have a broader definition of what's essential, right? And so that way it's not like Christianity's gone extinct. And I don't know why God works the way in history that he does. There's lots of things that are hard to explain. Okay, so that was your objection 1. Objection 2 was the atonement, right? Right? So here's what I would say with regards to the atonement. The New Testament never says that Jesus' atonement is efficacious because of his divinity. The New Testament only ever explains the efficaciousness of Jesus' atonement in view of his humanity, right? Like the book of Hebrews, he had to be like us, and he was tempted in every way that we are and without sin, and that's why he can be our high priest, is because he can relate to us in our weakness and stuff like that. And so we didn't talk too much about the incarnation. We spent more time on the Trinity, which is fine. But I think that even you would have to agree in some way that it's a difficulty for incarnation theories to explain how Jesus died. And often it's the case that Jesus died in his humanity but didn't die in his divinity, right? Somehow, there are various explanations for how it is, right? But if, his divine nature is necessarily immortal, right? And so his divine nature isn't the part that dies. So in that sense, I would say you don't think that Jesus' divinity died either, right? And so if his divinity doesn't die, how is his divinity doing any atoning work if it's his humanity that dies? And so if it's humanity that dies, then it must be his humanity that atones, in which case I don't see how we would disagree.
Yeah, that strikes me as pretty odd. I mean, it doesn't answer the first point that only a divine person could be sinless. A mere human could not be sinless. But to the other point, yeah, I don't see how a mere human also could withstand could be the proper recipient of
there's
God.
So I'll addressing the sinless question.
Yeah.
I would say that Adam and Eve could have been sinless. They had the potential, but they did not live up to their potential, right? And they sinned, and that was the fall. Mm-hmm. And that Jesus, by virtue of his virgin birth, was born without original sin, without the irresistible propensity to sin. But he was born with the potential where he could have sinned, right? I mean, I take that to be, if Jesus was tempted, right? And Hebrews clearly says he was tempted. The Gospels clearly show Satan tempting him. That in order to be tempted, you at least have to have the potential to sin. So Jesus, fair enough. But so I would say Jesus, unlike all the humans since Adam and Eve, was born without intrinsic sin nature by virtue of his virgin birth, and that he did what they didn't. He succeeded where they didn't. He lived a completely sinless life because that was possible, and he succeeded in doing what was possible. I don't know if you have any reactions to that.
I don't think that's probably the, well, let me just say that maybe a more plausible response you could give there would be that what explains Jesus' sinlessness is not his divine nature, it's his utter and complete reliance on the Holy Spirit.
Sure.
So you could go that route. I think that would probably be a little bit more compelling of a response, but I still don't think that would be enough. Yeah.
Okay. And then the other question is how could he bear the Father's wrath and stuff like that? Well, I would say there was a certain sense in which he wasn't able to bear it. It killed him, right? And that's kind of the whole point is that he absorbed the wrath of the Father, and it was fatal. So I don't know exactly what you mean by bearing it.
You're confusing physical death with spiritual death. Physical death just being the separation of body and soul, where spiritual death would be spiritual separation from God, not ontological separation. Obviously, that's impossible. But a spiritual chasm that occurs between fellowship with God. So I don't see how. I mean, clearly, to bring about Christ's physical death is not all that special or interesting, but to bring about Christ's spiritual death would be something akin to. I mean, how could there be a rift between the Father and the Son? How could there be spiritual death of the Son apart from introducing, in some sense, sin between Father and the Son?
Well, he was sin for us. He who had no sin was sin for us, right? So he was treated as if he was sinful, but he himself was not sinful.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, right. And that's the my God, why have you forsaken me and stuff like that.
That's right. Yeah.
So again, and I think another part of it is, another part of the whole atonement is the substitutableness, right? Mm-hmm. And that it would seem to me that a mere man is what's required to be a substitute for other men. And that a God-man, there's a certain sense in which it's not a fair substitute because it's sort of a horse of a different color or something like that. And that it's easier to explain the substitution when it's one man for a man.
It is one man for a man, but it's not a mere man. As long as you have a full human nature, that's what's sufficient. That's the fair trade. But I just don't think, and that's part of what makes the incarnation an act of grace, is that this one man wasn't a mere man. God actually became incarnate and humbled himself, just as Scripture says, to achieve atonement on our behalf. So yeah, I mean the theology.
And I guess there is something sort of like, I think part of what Anselm is trying to get at is it's almost like there needs to be something infinite about it so that it works like in sort of an infinite way or something like that. And like,
Yeah.
I'll say that I kind of hear, I kind of feel the intuition there, right? I don't think there's a biblical passage that backs up or requires that intuition. Sure. And I would say that it's almost maybe you could get to infinity because it's like a divide by zero or something like that. Yeah. Because of Jesus's complete purity and sinlessness, it's sort of like this. It's like a vacuum or something that absorbs infinity. And so I think that Christian Unitarians can get the full atonement theory by him being a sinless man who is in that case a perfect and translatable substitute.
So I'll agree that this theological argument does need to be sharpened up. There needs to be more rigorous reasons for thinking that only a God-man could achieve atonement. I would agree there.
Yeah, and then what was the third one? I've lost it from my memory.
Third one was, it just kind of dovetails neatly into the philosophical reasons, which is that we are made in the image of God. We are essentially social beings. And so we should probably expect God to be essentially a social being. We're not just like accidentally social beings. That is what we are by nature. And having been created in the image of God, we reflect God's nature in the deepest ways, I imagine. So that would probably include being a social being. Now, this argument that's just basically a theological point that needs to be strengthened by philosophical consideration, and it would be buttressed by arguments like Richard Swinburn's from the nature of love. You have full perfect love requires a lover, a beloved, and the sharing of that love with a third party. Now there may be other properties too that are essentially social like this, like rationality and praiseworthiness, but I think it's a plausible argument. It's not a knockdown argument. I think there can be good responses to that argument. But if we think about, think about the state of affairs of a Unitarian God, a single person. Think about a single solitary person where he refrains from creation. Okay, so, and he remains in solitude for all eternity. Now compare that state of affairs with the Trinitarian God, a tri-personal being who refrains from creation and exists in community for all eternity, not in solitude for all eternity. Well, it seems to me that the Trinitarian state of affairs is better, it's greater, it's more valuable than the Unitarian state of affairs. Worlds where God refrains from creation and there's nothing else besides God, well, the only thing that could make those states of affairs great would be God's being itself, right? So if the Trinitarian state of affairs is greater, it's more valuable than the Unitarian state of affairs, well, then that means the Trinitarian God's being is greater and more valuable than a Unitarian God's being.
I need to head out in just a minute here, and I think I'll give like a one sentence answer, and then I'll let you have the last word. I would say that there's something about that picture that seems to project a neediness onto God or something like that, as if God were to need something because he's lonely or something like that. And I would just say that I don't think God needs anything, and that that would seem unbefitting of God to require something like social interaction, even if it's totally in his nature to create in such a way that there is something. That would be something like my one sentence answer. But I'd love to give you sort of a closing word on the conversation before we head off.
Well, it wouldn't be a neediness. It would just be an entailment of perfection. But I would want to give two other philosophical arguments. I'll just mention in brief. One would be just from the nature of value. I think the nature of value is a kind of unity and diversity, and you can't have that. I think with a being that isn't a unity and diversity. And finally, my dissertation, really the heart of my dissertation was arguing from the principle of sufficient reason to the conclusion that God must have three parts. And I don't have space to develop that argument. I guess we don't have time to do that, but Yeah,
maybe
great.
next time
Yeah.
we could talk again. I've really enjoyed talking with you, Chad.
Sure. So between the biblical, the theological, the historical, the philosophical reasons, I think you put those all together. I think we have pretty powerful case for thinking that God must be a Trinity and not just one person.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Chad. It was wonderful talking with you. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, the questions that you put to me, I think were a bit more challenging than some of the other interviews I've had. So I really appreciated digging into this with you.
Sure.
Thanks, Sam. Appreciate it.
Thank you.